The day started like any other for Jonathan Parker, the manager of a high-end city bank. The building's tall glass windows reflected the morning light, and he was preparing for yet another routine day of managing wealthy clients. That was when she entered. She was a tall woman with a commanding presence. Dressed in a professional suit and carrying an elegant leather bag, she immediately turned heads as she walked toward the front desk. "Good morning," she said in a calm voice, handing over a check to the cashier. "I'd like to deposit this into my account." The cashier glanced at the amount on the check, visibly nervous. It was an impressive sum, larger than usual for the branch. This is quite a large amount. You may need to speak to the manager." "Of course," the woman replied without missing a beat, her face showing no emotion as she followed the cashier into the manager's office. "Mr. Parker, there's a customer who needs to speak with you regarding a deposit," the cashier said, peeking her head into his office. Jonathan looked up from his paperwork, frowning slightly as he noticed the woman entering the room. His experience told him that something about this situation didn't seem right. However, he maintained a professional demeanor. "How can I help you?" he asked, trying to sound polite, but his tone lacked warmth. "I'm here to deposit this check," she said, her voice steady and confident as she placed the check on his desk. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, eyeing the check carefully. It was a substantial amount of money, and he had to follow protocol, regardless of who the client was. "This is quite a significant sum," he said slowly. "I'll need to verify this check with our central office before processing the deposit." "I understand," the woman replied calmly, not showing any signs of impatience. "I'll wait for your confirmation." Jonathan picked up the phone and dialed the central office, all while keeping his eyes on the woman. Something about her didn't sit right with him. As he spoke on the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a routine deposit. He glanced at the cashier, who seemed just as uneasy as he felt. "I'll need some time to confirm this," he said, placing the phone down and turning back to the woman. "Please give me a moment." The woman gave a small nod and folded her hands in front of her, waiting patiently. Jonathan sat back in his chair, staring at the check with a sense of unease. The longer he looked at it, the more suspicious he became. "This is a large sum," he muttered under his breath, his mind racing through possible explanations. The check seemed legitimate, but something felt off. He cleared his throat and placed the check back on the desk, trying to mask his discomfort. "I'm sorry, but I'll need to verify the source of these funds." "I've provided all the necessary documentation," the woman said in a calm voice, her expression still unreadable. Jonathan frowned, his suspicions growing. "I'm sorry, but I'll need to double-check everything. This is standard procedure." The woman didn't react to the tone in his voice. She simply nodded and sat back in the chair. Jonathan picked up the phone again, this time dialing the bank's headquarters for additional confirmation. As he spoke to someone on the other end of the line, his eyes kept drifting back to the woman. His mind raced. He knew he was following procedure, but a small voice in his head couldn't shake the feeling that he was doing something wrong. Meanwhile, the woman remained calm and composed, her demeanor unshaken despite the growing tension in the room. After a few moments, Jonathan hung up the phone, his face tense. "I'm sorry, but I'll need to delay this transaction for further verification." "I've already provided everything you need," the woman replied evenly. "I expect this to be processed immediately." Jonathan's jaw tightened, and he felt a flash of frustration. "I'm sorry, but I decide how things are processed here, not you." The tension in the room became palpable. Staff members peered from behind their desks, sensing that something was off. The cashier, Eliza, stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Parker, I've seen this client before. She's one of our largest depositors. There's no need for this delay." Jonathan turned to her sharply. "Eliza, I've got this. You can go back to your work." His tone was dismissive. Eliza hesitated, casting a quick glance at the woman before retreating to her desk. The woman, meanwhile, remained unfazed. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Hello, yes, I need to speak with someone in leadership. There seems to be an issue with a transaction at one of your branches," she said calmly. Jonathan frowned. "Whoever you're calling, they'll tell you the same thing. We need to follow procedure." Before the woman could respond, the door to the office swung open, and in walked a woman in a sharp business suit. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice firm and authoritative. Jonathan's heart sank as he realized who this was. The woman in the sharp business suit stepped into the office, her presence immediately commanding attention. "I'm Jean Thompson, the regional director," she said, her voice cold but professional. Jonathan stood up quickly, his face turning pale. He had not expected Jean to arrive at the branch. "Jean, I wasn't expecting you," he stammered. Jean glanced at the woman sitting calmly at the desk, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Brooks, I didn't know you were here. Is there a problem?" The woman, Cynthia Brooks, turned to John, her tone even but laced with subtle irritation. "It seems that Mr. Parker believes my check needs extra scrutiny, though all the documentation is in order." Jean's expression shifted from neutrality to clear displeasure. She turned toward Jonathan, her voice sharp. "Jonathan, do you understand who this is?" Jonathan swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of the situation. I wasn't aware," he muttered, his face flushing. Jean's gaze turned icy. "This is Miss Cynthia Brooks, one of our most important clients. She is also the largest shareholder in this bank, with a controlling stake." Jonathan's face turned ashen as he realized his mistake. He tried to salvage the situation. "I was just following procedure," he stammered. "Procedure?" Jean's voice grew colder. "You should have done your due diligence before questioning a client. Not only did you embarrass Miss Brooks, but you also jeopardized our relationship with one of our top investors." Cynthia's eyes narrowed as she stood up from the chair. She glanced at Jonathan with a look that conveyed her displeasure. "Jean, I believe we can resolve this matter quickly," Cynthia said, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Parker, you've made a serious error in judgment, and there will be consequences." Jean motioned for Cynthia to follow her. "Let's move to the conference room, Miss Brooks. I'll make sure everything is taken care of." As they left the office, Jonathan stood frozen, his mind racing with panic. He realized that the consequences of his actions were far greater than he had anticipated. A few moments later, Jean returned to Jonathan's office. She stood before him, her expression stern. "Do you realize who you just offended?" Jean asked, her tone unforgiving. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He could only nod, feeling the weight of his mistake. "This isn't just a mistake," Jean continued, her voice ice cold. "It's a reflection of your attitude. We don't tolerate that kind of behavior here, especially when it's directed at someone who has invested millions into this bank." Jonathan opened his mouth again, but he knew there was no excuse. He was trapped in his own arrogance. "There will be consequences, Jonathan," Jean said quietly. "You need to face the reality of your actions." As Jean left his office, Jonathan sat down in his chair, his mind numb. He realized that this was just the beginning of the downfall of his career. The next day, Jonathan sat nervously in the conference room, awaiting the arrival of the bank's leadership team. His palms were sweating as he recalled the events that had unfolded. He could hardly believe that his career had come to this point. The mistake he had made was more than just an error. It was a reflection of his own biases and arrogance. As the door opened, Jean Thompson entered, followed by several senior managers. They sat at the table, their faces serious. Cynthia Brooks entered last, her presence commanding attention. "Jonathan, we've gathered here today to address a serious matter," Jean began, her voice steady. "Yesterday's incident was not just an isolated mistake. It points to deeper issues that we need to fix immediately." Jonathan sat up straighter, his anxiety mounting as Cynthia's gaze settled on him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "As the largest shareholder in this bank," Cynthia said calmly, "I have the responsibility to ensure that the bank operates with integrity and respect for all clients, regardless of their background." "Jonathan," she continued, her voice firm, "your behavior was unacceptable. Not only did you question a longtime client without reason, but you also disrespected someone who is integral to the success of this institution." Jean nodded in agreement. "We've seen how biases can influence decisions in ways we don't even realize. It's crucial that we address this, not just with Jonathan, but throughout the entire bank." Jonathan opened his mouth to protest, but Cynthia raised a hand to silence him. "You've had your chance to speak, Jonathan. Now it's time for action." She turned to the team. "I propose that we implement immediate changes within this institution. First, mandatory cultural competence training for all employees to ensure that biases are addressed at every level. Second, we will review all current procedures to ensure they do not discriminate against any of our clients, no matter their background, race, or financial status. Finally," Cynthia added, We will establish a clear and confidential mechanism for clients and employees to report concerns about discrimination or bias without fear of retaliation. Jean looked around the room, seeing nods of agreement from the team. These changes are not negotiable, she said firmly. They will be implemented within the next 30 days. Jonathan sat still, his face pale as the weight of his actions began to settle in. He realized that no matter what happened, his position at the bank was no longer secure. Cynthia stood up, her voice calm but resolute. I expect full cooperation from all of you. Our clients deserve better, and this bank will rise to meet those expectations. As she walked out of the conference room, Jonathan's fate was sealed. He knew there was no way back. The bank was going to change, and so would he. The next morning, Jonathan Parker stood outside the door of the Human Resources office. His heart was heavy with dread. He had been summoned for a meeting that would determine his future. As he waited, his mind raced with thoughts of how everything had gone wrong. His career, which had once seemed so secure, was now in jeopardy because of his poor decision. He knew that his actions had gone far beyond a simple mistake. He had allowed his personal biases to cloud his judgment, and now the consequences were catching up with him. As the door opened, the head of Human Resources, Natalie Green, motioned for him to enter. He stepped inside, his nerves making his movements stiff. Jonathan Parker, Natalie said, her voice firm but calm, please sit down. We need to discuss your actions from yesterday and the fallout that has followed. Jonathan nodded but didn't say anything. He was too nervous to speak, knowing that no words could undo what had been done. The incident yesterday was brought to my attention, and I've had the chance to review all the details, Natalie continued, her eyes focused on him. What you did was more than just an error in judgment. Jonathan's face flushed. He could feel his stomach turning as the reality of the situation sank in. He had failed not only his client, but also the very institution he worked for. Your behavior was discriminatory, Jonathan, Natalie continued, her voice stern. You made assumptions based on race and financial status, and you treated a valued client with suspicion. That's unacceptable. Jonathan opened his mouth to defend himself, but Natalie held up a hand, silencing him. I'm not interested in excuses, she said. This isn't just about a mistake. It's about integrity and the values we uphold at this bank. You were given the responsibility to ensure that all clients, regardless of their background, were treated with fairness and respect, Natalie said, and you failed to do so. There was a long pause as Jonathan sat, his head bowed in shame. Finally, Natalie spoke again. Given the severity of your actions, we've decided to terminate your employment here. Jonathan's stomach dropped. He had expected this, but hearing the words aloud made it all too real. I understand, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Natalie nodded and handed him an envelope. This is your severance package, she said. Please pack your things and leave by the end of the day. As Jonathan left the room, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his actions. His career was over, and he had no one to blame but himself. Outside the office, Cynthia was waiting. Her face was calm, but there was a sense of satisfaction in her expression. The changes she had advocated for were beginning to take root. The following day, Cynthia Brooks arrived at the bank headquarters for a meeting with the senior management team. As the largest shareholder, she was now taking charge of the changes she had promised. As she entered the conference room, the management team stood up in respect. Cynthia nodded politely, but her expression was serious. She had made it clear that change was necessary, and she wasn't going to waste any more time. Thank you all for coming, Cynthia began. As I said yesterday, the incident at the downtown branch was unacceptable, and I'm here to make sure that this doesn't happen again. She addressed the group directly, her voice calm yet authoritative. I expect a full review of all bank procedures with a special focus on training staff to eliminate bias and improve customer relations. Cynthia paused, allowing her words to sink in. She could see the management team exchanging glances, some of them uncomfortable with the shift in direction, but Cynthia remained unfazed. We will begin mandatory training on diversity and inclusion for all employees, Cynthia continued. This is not a suggestion, it's a requirement. She turned to the bank's CEO, a middle-aged man named Mark Dawson. Mark, I expect you to oversee the implementation of these changes. They need to be completed within the next month. Mark nodded, though his face showed the strain of the situation. Cynthia had made it clear that the bank's future was on the line. He couldn't afford to let her down. Now, as for Jonathan Parker, Cynthia continued, he has been terminated, but we will also be conducting a thorough investigation into his actions to ensure this kind of behavior is never tolerated again. The room was silent. The management team knew that this was just the beginning. Cynthia wasn't going to let the incident slide, and she was determined to reshape the bank's culture. Cynthia stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "I'll be following up on these changes personally," she said. "I expect your full cooperation. Let's get to work." As she left the room, the management team remained silent, but they knew that the days of complacency were over. Cynthia had set a new course, and they would have to follow it, no matter what. A few days later, Jonathan Parker sat in his small office at home, staring at the termination letter in front of him. His mind raced as he replayed the events at the bank. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had unraveled. One simple decision had cost him his career. His pride was shattered, and he was consumed with regret. Meanwhile, Cynthia Brooks had returned to the downtown branch to meet with some of the employees. She walked through the bank's sleek modern lobby, her presence commanding respect. The staff greeted her with smiles, but there was an underlying sense of tension. They all knew the changes were coming, and they weren't sure what to expect. Cynthia addressed them in the lobby, her tone firm but encouraging. "I know the past week has been difficult, but I want you all to know that this is the start of something positive. We are going to work together to build a better environment, one where everyone is treated with fairness and respect. The changes I've proposed will take time, but they are necessary." She looked at Eliza, who was standing at the back of the room. "Eliza, you've shown real integrity and courage throughout this process. I want to make sure you're part of the future we're creating here." Eliza's face flushed with surprise, and the other staff members looked on in awe. They hadn't expected Cynthia to recognize her so publicly. "Thank you, Miss Brooks," Eliza said, her voice shaking slightly. "I appreciate your confidence in me." Cynthia smiled warmly. "You deserve it. Now let's move forward together." With that, Cynthia left the branch, feeling a sense of accomplishment. She knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a journey worth taking. Meanwhile, back at the headquarters, Mark Dawson was already working on implementing the changes Cynthia had outlined. He knew that the success of the bank depended on its ability to adapt. As for Jonathan, his future was uncertain. He had made a fatal mistake, and the consequences were severe. He would need to reflect on his actions and learn from this experience. The incident had changed everything. It had shown the staff and the management team that the bank was capable of change, but only if they were willing to confront their biases and take responsibility for their actions. Cynthia's actions had made it clear. There was no room for discrimination or bias in the bank she owned. It was now up to everyone else to make sure the change stuck. As Cynthia left the building for the last time that day, she walked with her head held high. She knew her work was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next.